Hey guys, so I saw this question online in the group all day long. Actually, it seemed like there was a ton of debate, ton of questions on it. So I thought I'd give you my 2 cents and really kind of explain to you guys why this question, for how it's worded and the answer options that are there, wouldn't make it to National Registry. Right, so we're going to talk through it, we're going to break it down and everything, and I'll explain why I kind of can make a statement like that for really not being able to get this. So when we go through the question, you have an unresponsive 42-year-old male was struck by a vehicle. The question, I just kind of quick shortened it a little bit. It was walking across the street, something like that. He has a scalp laceration and an angulated left lower leg. Breath sounds are clear. Vital signs provided were a pulse of 124, respirations of 16, and a blood pressure of 92/68. And the question is asking you, you should suspect what? Right, so going through, we have to, kind of play that process of elimination game. And it's really going to be the best way to actually approach this question, because realistically, I could probably argue two or three of these answers pretty confidently. Right, so going through it right away, answer number 1, epidural bleeding. Now, the thing about epidural bleeding that is kind of supported by this question is you have somebody who's struck by a vehicle, they're unresponsive. They at least took some amount of trauma to their head with the scalp laceration, right? But we don't really have enough information, right? One of the key pieces that you'll get with an epidural bleed is a down, up, down mental status presentation, right? Where they get hit in the head, they go unconscious. Right? After a short little bit, they wake back up. They have that lucid interval, right? Where they're alert, awake, and talking some capacity. And then they go altered, they go back down, they stay down. So literally every single kind of test bank style question I've seen that references an epidural bleed, they always give you that down, up, down mental status presentation, right? So what we don't have in this question is that presentation, right? We don't have that mental status wax and wane, right? Epidural bleeds are generally considered pretty fast, so maybe he already went through that, and that we start to get into that slippery slope of assumptions, right? And the other big thing about head bleeds and that increasing intracranial pressure, which is what we have, is they'll usually push the presentation to a more extreme kind of classical presentation style. So beyond the mental status, somebody with a closed head injury, increasing intracranial pressure because of this bleeding in the head, pretty much all the presentations that you're going to be given are going to be given a hypertensive patient, even pushing all the way towards like the Cushing's triad signs of increased intracranial pressure, where you have the high and wide blood pressure, right, where that systolic number gets very high and that diastolic number drops down, and bradycardia and irregular respirations, right? So most of those really end up getting emphasized to it. It's my son in the background, right? So we have a not hypertensive by any stretch of it. We actually have, technically by definition in our textbook, we have a still normal systolic blood pressure, albeit on the low end, right? But really 90 up to a 130 is the normal systolic blood pressure range provided by kind of the average main EMT textbook that's out there. So the head bleed, right, specifically the epidural bleed even, we don't have that mental status story, right? If they said you have an unresponsive patient who was struck by a vehicle that was unconscious after getting struck by the vehicle, woke back up, was talking to bystanders, and now you find him unresponsive, right? They provide that story that kind of references the mental status. That's really going to point you towards that epidural bleed, right? But kind of even more broadly opening up the closed head injury, increasing ICP, then you're really looking, again, for that Cushing's triad of the high and wide blood pressure, the bradycardia, and the irregular respiratory pattern, right? Sometimes fast, sometimes slow, but usually irregular, right? That's where you get some of those like Cheney-Stokes respirations or ataxic Biot's respirations, right? Something there. So we don't really have that. We don't have the bradycardia. We don't have the irregular respirations. They don't actually give us information on regularity. Right? And we have a normal, albeit borderline bottom end of normal range blood pressure. Right? None of these things are really pointing to that head bleed, other than the fact that he's unresponsive post-car accident. Right? We're going to kind of compare that one. So I don't feel great about the epidural bleed answer right now, but not definitively out, right? But again, generally that down, up, down mental status, I can't kind of promise you enough that they'll float that in there if your answer is an epidural bleed. All right, so next up on our list is answer B, hemothorax, right? Hemothorax, really the big kind of piece that takes that answer out is that our breath sounds are still clear. Right? Generally, right, the hemothorax, again, in these presentations, they typically push to the more extreme presentation. So if we're thinking about a big enough hemothorax that you have diminished breath sounds on one side, right, maybe absent entirely, but even, you know what, if there was a tiny, tiny little bit of blood in that pleural cavity, definitionally that would be hemothorax, right? So you could still have clear bilateral breath sounds and the faintest, teeniest amount of little blood in there, hemothorax by definition, right? But really, with the hemothorax, we think the bleeding out, right? Bleeding out, you start thinking, because each hemithorax, each side of your chest can hold about 2 liters of blood, right? So potential for significant blood loss there. Blood pressure bottom into normal, all right? Kind of points towards that shock progression. Increased heart rate, right? But one of the big ones, again, going back to these respiratory rates, this answer, this variable right there of a respiratory rate of 16 being perfectly great is the biggest issue for me in this whole question, or probably one of the big issues for me in this whole question, right? In the whole shock progression sequence, one of the first vital signs that will change for an adult patient especially, one of the first vital signs that's going to change for an adult patient is tachypnea, right? That respiratory rate's going to start going up because at the core of the shock progression problem is something somewhere is not getting enough oxygen, right? If we use that other name for shock, hypoperfusion, something somewhere is not getting enough oxygen, that brain's going to go, I can fix that problem, let's breathe faster to get more oxygen in the system. Followed by, let's pump faster so we can deliver all that oxygen, right? So the fact that we have a still phenomenal respiratory rate of 16 really kind of takes these shock answers out of it for me, honestly, it really does. So I don't like hemothorax because breath sounds are clear, they're probably going to push you towards a more significant presentation. And certainly if this was his principal cause, that he's been bleeding out into the pleural cavity, right? If he's bled out that much that he's unresponsive, right? We're going to see a greater drop in blood pressure, probably a faster heart rate, to be brutally honest, for a 42-year-old, and definitely an increased respiratory rate. So for me, I strike hemothorax, right? Which, looking through the questions that you guys were all posting online, I don't think I saw anybody that's making an argument for that one, so hopefully that made sense. Okay. Third down, cardiac tamponade. Right? And cardiac tamponade is another one that nobody was really getting, right? Everybody was kind of debating and talking through this head bleed and intra-abdominal bleed, right? But we still should talk about cardiac tamponade, little added value for you reviewing that Beck's triad, right? So we had Cushing's triad for the increased intracranial pressure. We're going to talk about Beck's triad for cardiac tamponade, right? But with the cardiac tamponade, right, altered mental status could make sense. Right? Dipping blood pressure would make sense. Increasing heart rate would make sense. Once again, with a cardiac tamponade issue that was progressing this bad that a patient would be unresponsive, that respiratory rate is going to be climbing, right? So again, that's another one for me. I don't like any of these answers because of this respiratory rate. Right? So cardiac tamponade with Beck's triad, right? We talk about a narrowing pulse pressure, right? Narrowing pulse pressure. That means our systolic and diastolic numbers are getting closer and closer together. Right? So trending helps with this one. Right? We only have one set of vitals here, or at least we only have one blood pressure. We have a 92/68. So if they gave us a second blood pressure and said 5 minutes later your next blood pressure is 88/72, right? Those numbers got closer together, big giant red flag should go off in your head saying cardiac tamponade. The tachycardia we'll see. Right? The other two with cardiac tamponade that they'll lob you up a big softball if you just remember Beck's triad. Right? There's a narrowing pulse pressure, the muffled heart tones. Right? So if we actually got our stethoscope and listen to heart tones, those are going to be what they call muffled or quiet or more dull, just because you're trying to now listen to that heart through a bunch of other stuff and the heart isn't actually pumping as strong. Since it's not filling up as much, it's not pumping as hard either. So it's a lot weaker of a contraction. So muffled heart tones. And then the third one is jugular vein distension, that JVD. Again, not a variable that they've provided us here. So something that we don't really have kind of that helpful bit of information to really more confidently tell us cardiac tamponade. Right? They don't not tell us it's there, right? We really need more information in this question. Right? If they provided just a teeny bit more information and changed that respiratory rate, there's one definitive answer. Right? So I'm going to strike cardiac tamponade as well. And again, like I said, I don't think anybody was making an argument for that in the group. And that leaves us intra-abdominal bleeding, which I believe, if I remember right, is what it was actually keyed as. And you know what? It probably makes the most sense-ish. Yeah, that's really the best I can give you on this one. Intra-abdominal bleeding, right, in PHTLS, under the National Association of EMTs, PHTLS really says, you know, signs of shock in the absence of a obvious cause, like an arterial, bleed, right? Signs of shock without an obvious cause, and trauma is assumed to be intra-abdominal bleeding until proven otherwise, right? But that was a big, giant, concerning word for me in that statement, which is assumed, right? Don't assume anything. On National Registry, all of the information you need is provided, and there's only one definitively correct answer, right? There's not going to be 2 or 3 or 4 that you can argue about, right? I've understand it. I've been on the item writing committees at National Registry in Ohio. There's only one way, there's only one answer, right? There's a couple maybe distracting answers or close-ish answers, but when everybody sits around that table and they put that question up on the big screen and we all debate about it, right? It's medical directors, program directors, instructors that sit there and say, well, you know what? C could have been a correct answer for that one. And so it's like, all right, cool, let's change C so it's definitely a wrong question, right? That's why there's very little likelihood of being able to actually contact National Registry and challenge a question that you get on the test, because they're so validated. There's so many eyes on every single question that it's just not going to happen. Right? So intra-abdominal bleeding, right, again, assumed in trauma is a pretty safe assumption, but it's an assumption, so we're not going to do it. We're not going to use that word at all to justify an answer that we're choosing. Right? Everything we need should be in the question to choose a for sure correct answer. So again, big part in intra-abdominal bleeding, just like some of the other ones, if they've been bleeding enough that they're unresponsive, that's a significant bleed, right? If now cerebral perfusion has dropped, we're not getting enough blood flow and oxygen to the brain, that they're unresponsive, that's a pretty significant bleed. So the low normal blood pressure makes sense. Unresponsive, you'd probably expect it to be for sure hypotensive. Tachycardia, absolutely, compensatory mechanism in your hypovolemic hemorrhagic shock progressions, absolutely. So tachycardia, we're good with that. One last time, I hate that respiratory rate, right? Because your respiratory rate is going to go up, right? As a compensatory mechanism where we're not getting enough oxygen into the body, that respiratory rate is going to go up, right? So that's a big piece for me that says no to this one, right? The other stuff kind of makes sense, right? Breath sounds are still clear, that would make sense. That blood pressure is there. So really, with this question, from my experience, it would have been beaten up pretty rough at the item writing sessions. We're actually debating on whether we should put this question into the test bank. Right? It would be beaten up pretty significantly because the vital signs open up a little bit too much of some variability over, you can make an argument for some of these. Right? Fully unresponsive or an unresponsive patient with these vitals, right? I don't feel great about it, right? So you really have to take a look at this, and if this was a question that I wrote, right, I would be adding in a little bit more information, right? If I wanted to key it as intra-abdominal bleeding, which I believe it was, I'd push them to Kipnick. I'd probably push a higher heart rate, and I would push a lower blood pressure if I'm keeping them unresponsive. So the trauma context, right? Nobody's probably bleeding out because of a tib-fib fracture of their left lower leg. Right? Scalp laceration, scalp is highly vascular. You can bleed pretty significantly from that, but again, we're probably not looking at it. Right? So for the information that's there, they would need to kind of rework it, clarify it a little bit, maybe even change some of the answers to more definitively incorrect answers, or really just tweak the information provided so that there's only one answer. Because that's it in a nutshell, is all the information that you need and nothing else is provided here. Right? There's not, just fluff information provided, right? Everything that it contributes to assessing somebody's ability to kind of answer a question appropriately, right? Because remember, that's registry. All they're doing is assessing competency with these test questions written by program directors and medical directors. So they're assessing competency, and in order to do that, they have to be really dang confident that there's no argument for the other three answers and there's only one answer, right? So in order to get a more confident question like this, actually to see it on your national registry test, right, they're gonna need slightly more information or different information, especially around that respiratory rate. Slightly changed up question, or maybe changed up answers so that there's just truly no other option. There's no chance that this one or this one or this one could be it. There's only one correct answer. So that's really kind of my 2 cents on it, right? I get why it's keyed as intra-abdominal bleeding, but there's just not quite enough, or at least not quite enough correct information to support one definitive best answer. So I hope this was helpful. If you guys have any other questions or whatever, I love being able to actually take the exact question that you have a question on, help you break it down, and help you explain it. So if you do, just message me, and I'll do more videos like this. My name's Andrew Johnston, and on social and everything, I've got my page Medic Made Easy as well. Either of those will be great. It'll get to me, and I'm more than happy to do some videos like this. So have a good night, everybody, and hopefully this was helpful.